We have a really special keynote speaker, special speaker, to take us through some myths and whether they are myths or whether they are true in this whole area. I'll give you a bit of background about our next speaker. She's a Professor of Finance and Commonwealth Bank Chair in Finance at the University of New South Wales. She's also held positions at the Stockholm School of Economics and the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. She holds a PhD from Chicago, a master's from Stanford. Well, I could go on and on, but I think you've probably got the picture now. She is very well qualified to discuss the subject in hand. Please welcome Professor Renee Adams.
All right. Well, thanks very much for coming. And first, I'd like to thank Swift very much for inviting me. Today happens to be my birthday. And thank you. And this setting makes me feel like a star. So what better gift to give me on my birthday? Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be talking about myths about boardroom diversity and research truths about boardroom diversity. Now, why is this interesting? Well, if you believe that women are underrepresented on boards because of stereotypes, then I think an important question we have to ask ourselves is, should one then also promote women on the basis of stereotypes? And so I think our answer on the basis of our research is no, one should not. And why not? Because if you promote women on the basis of stereotypes, you don't actually figure out what the problems are that need to be addressed. Okay? And this is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with my co-author, Tom Kirschmeyer, who's sitting over there. And normally, if my co-author were not sitting here, I would say any mistakes, you can blame him. But he's here, so I can't say that. And Tom is a lecturer in business economics at Manchester Business School. All right, so the 5 myths I'm going to be talking about today. First, are female directors just like male directors? So is this an important question? Yes, because if they are, then why do we worry about this whole diversity thing? Okay. Second myth. The usual surveys that we're familiar with, like the Catalyst surveys about Fortune 500 companies, they tell us exactly what women's representation on boards is. Third myth, very relevant for the women in finance theme. The financial crisis would not have happened if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters. And fourth myth, it's all any HR directors here. If there are, it's all your fault. Okay. And finally, the very popular one, there's a business case for adding women to the board. If you add a woman to the board, shareholder value increases. Okay, let's get started. Myth number 1, female directors are just like male directors. Actually, research shows that they're quite different. And the interesting thing is they're very different from male directors, but in ways that one wouldn't necessarily expect. So I'm going to show you some evidence. If you look up at the screen, what we have here is we have 10, they're called human values. Okay, so one human value, for example, is achievement. There's another one, benevolence, conformity, hedonism. So there's 10 of these values. And what I've done here is I've made a graph. The 0 is always the bar for the men, and the 1 is the bar for the women. Okay? And so basically, what does this graph represent? It's data on directors and their human values. So we have data on male directors and female directors. So for example, male directors score 0.131 on achievement, female directors 0.114. Okay, so hopefully you're all with me on this graph. Okay, so what's the interesting thing about this graph? Well, first we see that the bars are not identical. So women and men in the boardroom are different. Now, what's even more interesting, for example, we see that women, if you look at conformity, female directors are less conformist than male directors. Okay, so that's good news for the diversity camp, right? Because you have the women who are supposed to bring in new ideas. They're less power-oriented than men. Another very interesting one is they're less tradition-oriented than men. Now, this is interesting because if you measure these values in the population, so not looking at directors, what you usually find is women are more tradition-oriented than men. Now, you go to the boardroom, women are less tradition-oriented than men. Okay, so this is interesting because it means that the women in the boardroom are not exactly like the women in the population, right? There's something different about them. So women are different from men in the boardroom, and the women in the boardroom are different from the women in the population. Now, this is one of my favorite ones, and this relates to the whole women in finance issue. So what we have here are measures of risk aversion. So the 0, that's the measure of risk aversion for men, 4.412, and 4.106 for the female directors. What does this slide tell us? The female directors are less risk averse than the male directors. So what is the point? Here, female directors are not exactly like male directors. They're quite different, and they're different in ways that we don't necessarily expect, okay? And in particular, one very important one, relevant for here, is that the female directors are less risk-averse than the male directors. Okay, myth number 2. So the usual surveys that we always see, like the Catalyst surveys and everything, they always say, oh, you know, it's so terrible, there's so few women on boards, right? So should we believe their numbers? And we actually argue, no, we shouldn't believe their numbers. In fact, the situation is much worse than those numbers actually are leading us to believe. What's the problem? They always look at large firms, right? So all these surveys, they always look at large firms. As soon as you look at the small firms, there's basically no women. So women are more likely to be represented on the boards of large firms. So these surveys totally overstate the case. And another problem is women are also more likely to have multiple directorships, okay? Now, as soon as you start thinking about, well, how many unique women serve on boards, the numbers are terrible. So let me just show you some quick evidence on this issue. So what I have here is I have a couple of countries, data for a couple of countries, and what we have in the table are measures of diversity, so it's simply the average fraction of women on the board. Okay, so for example, in Germany, there's 13% women on the board, and the first column is according to the EU. So the EU puts out a survey of women on boards. It's of large firms in different countries in Europe. And their number is 13% for Germany, okay? Now, we got some data that's much more comprehensive, and what's our number? 6%, okay? So according to the EU, there's 13% female directors on boards. According to us, there's 6%. So you look at the Netherlands, 15% according to the EU, 7% according to our numbers. The UK, another one of my favorites, 13% according to the EU and 6% according to us. Now, what explains the difference? The EU numbers are based on 49 firms. Our numbers are based on 1,243. And the 49 firms that they look at, these are the largest firms in the UK. The 1,243 firms that we look at, they include both large and small firms. Okay, so as soon as you look outside the large firms, the picture is much worse than we're actually led to believe. So why is this important? Why are the numbers and the measurement, why are they important? Well, because first, the situation is much worse than people say it is. So if you think we have a problem based on the standard numbers that we see, our numbers tell us that, well, actually, it's much worse, right? So we really have a problem. And second, we haven't talked about the multiple directorship thing, or I haven't shown you the evidence, but what we also argue is there's a lack of debate about the proper policy objective. So should we care about having lots, like one woman on many boards, or lots of women on boards? And so as soon as you start thinking about the measurement, then you realize that this is really an important question. Okay, one of my favorites, very relevant for the theme here during this week, the financial crisis would not have happened if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters. So my answer to that is yes, it would have, right? Women can also cause a crisis, thank you very much. And what is the key issue here? Female directors, this relates back to the myth number 1, female directors are not the same people as are in the population, right? So there's a lot of self-selection going on. The women who choose to follow a career path that leads to a directorship are not likely to be very risk averse. Okay? And I'll show you some evidence to back this up. So basically what this evidence is based on is an experiment at University of Chicago. And basically, what we have here is data on the entire entering class of MBA students at the University of Chicago. These students were asked, how much would you pay to avoid a risky lottery? So the more you're willing to pay, the more risk-averse you are. And then once they graduated, one can observe which field they entered, so whether they entered the finance field in particular. And so now I'm going to show you how the selection works. So if you look at the top left panel, we have men in the top bar, women in the bar in the middle. And so basically what this measures is just how much you're willing to pay to avoid the risky lottery. So the bar for the women is longer than for the men, so that means women are willing to pay more on average. So if you look in the entire MBA class, women are more risk-averse than men. Okay, so that's the typical finding, right? That's what people always say. Women are more risk-averse than men. Okay, so now let's look over into the top right box. What we have here are the same numbers for the men who, when they graduated, entered into finance. Okay, so the non-finance graduates, that's the top bar, and the finance graduates, that's the middle bar. And so basically what you see is the top bar is a little bit longer than the middle bar. So that means the guys who didn't go into finance were slightly more risk-averse than the other guys who didn't go into finance, okay, because they're willing to pay a little bit more to avoid the lottery. Okay. But the differences are not striking, right? So the guys who didn't go into finance, a little bit more risk-averse, but not ridiculously more risk-averse. Okay, now we look at the women. That's the bottom right box. What do you see? So the top number, or the top bar again, is how much the women who didn't go into finance were willing to pay to avoid the lottery. So it's a measure of their risk aversion. The middle bar is how much the women who went into finance were willing to pay. What do we see here? A striking difference between the women who didn't go into finance and the women who did go into finance. In particular, the women who didn't go into finance were much more risk-averse than the women who went into finance, or vice versa, the women who went into finance much less risk-averse than the women who didn't go into finance. Okay, and you see that the differences are quite different than for the men going into finance or not going into finance, right? They're much more striking. Okay, so now let's look at the men and women in finance. So that's the bottom left box. Basically, you see here we have the measures of risk aversion for men at the top, for women in the middle. And if anything, the women are less risk averse than the men. Okay, so it's almost identical, but the women are willing to pay slightly less than the men to avoid the risky lottery. Okay, so this is basically how the selection works. So the women who choose to go into finance, much less risk averse than the women who don't choose to go into finance. And as a result, when you look at men and women in finance, the women, if anything, at least in this data set that we have, are less risk averse than the men. Why is this important? Well, I think promoting women on the basis of stereotypes does them a disservice, right? So one has to realize that the women who enter into finance might be pretty different from the woman who's in the typical experiment that people run, and on the basis of which they then conclude that women are more risk averse than men. Okay, myth number 4, HR directors are to blame. So there's a lot of gender policies going on worldwide. I'll show you a graph in a couple slides. All of these policies are targeted at companies, right? So basically, implicitly, it's always the company's fault, right? The problem has to be solved at the company level. So is this necessarily the case? We argue life is not that simple. In particular, our research shows that societal factors are very important. Female labor force participation is very important. Culture and education matter. So I'll just show you a little bit of evidence relating to this issue. So what we do in this research is we take one stereotype about women and relate it to the representation of women on boards. And the stereotype about women that we're interested in here is a stereotype that girls can't do math. Okay, so people say girls can't do math, right? Is it a biological difference between women and men? No, right? There's no biological difference between women and men in their ability to do math. Okay. Now, why do women underperform men or girls underperform boys in school? a lot of it has to do with stereotypes, and there's a huge body of literature arguing that this is true. Okay, so let's take this stereotype. Now, which sector is the math gender gap stereotype likely to be particularly relevant for? Let's see, finance, possibly, right? So if you're in finance, you should probably be able to know a little bit about math, right? So we looked at whether this gender stereotype, in particular relating to girls' inability to do math, is related to their representation, or not the girls' representation, right, but the representation of women on the boards of financials. Okay, so here's our evidence. So again, I took the university seriously. We have a slide here with 4 graphs, and what we have on the top 2 graphs is data for the representation of women on the boards of banks. And this is across countries now. And basically what we do is we take the PISA math test scores, which you may or may not be familiar with, but basically the OECD runs a big math test program, and they publish it every couple of years, and they say the big news is always, oh, the girls underperform the boys. Right? So we take this data, we divide countries into countries where the girls do worse than the boys, where that number is particularly bad, and where it's not so bad. So the gender gap is not so bad. Okay, so if you look at the top right graph, basically what we have there is if the gender gap in math is above median, so the girls really underperform the boys, that's the red line in the top right graph. And if the girls don't do so bad relative to the boys, that's a blue line. Okay, so what we're graphing there is the representation of women, so the fraction of women on the board of banks in those countries. And basically, you see very clearly that the bigger the gender gap in math, the fewer women are represented on the boards of financial firms, in particular banks, in those countries. Okay. Now, you could say, well, this is just a cultural phenomenon, right? Maybe we're not picking up really a stereotype related to math. If you look at the bottom right graph, we do the same thing for non-financials. Okay, so the red line, again, is if the gender gap in math is particularly bad, and the blue line is if the gender gap in math is not so bad. And what do you see? There's not such a striking difference in the representation of women as a function of whether the gender gap in math is very big or not. Okay. Now, if you look at the left panel, the top left, this is not looking at the gender gap, it's just looking at math education, a measure of math education. So we just look at math scores. In countries where math scores generally are very high, you have more women on the boards of banks. In countries where math scores are not so high, fewer women on the boards of banks. Okay. So what does this tell us? It tells us that stereotypes are very important, and we've basically illustrated that one particular stereotype related to girls' inability to do math seems to have an impact for financial firms, for the representation of women on the boards of financial firms. So what is the implication? It's not just HR directors, right? So this is a societal problem. If we want to fix some of these problems, some of the pipeline issues, we basically have to start very, very early. Okay. So companies cannot solve these problems on their own, but their input into policy making can be crucial, right? So I think this is really important. Companies also have to say, look, it's not just us. We also have to help and fix societal problems. Okay, final one, and this is the one that everyone always loves. Adding a woman to your board will necessarily increase shareholder value. So I'm sorry, but life is just not that simple, right? Adding a woman to some boards may increase value. Adding a woman to other boards may decrease value. I mean, I'm just sorry to say it's not all about gender, okay? It's about who the person is, much more important. And in particular, when we think about you're a woman, as I said before, women often have multiple directorships, right? So they may have many offers to sit on boards because, it's a scarce commodity to have the right woman to sit on a board. And you're the woman saying, well, should I join the board? The woman's not stupid, right? She's going to say, well, I'm going to join the board of this very well-performing firm because that's a fantastic opportunity. And so then you correlate performance with women on the board. Well, obviously you get a positive correlation, right? But correlation does not imply causation. So why is this important to say that there may not necessarily be a business case for boardroom diversity? It's because creating false expectations for women does them a disservice. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say boardroom policies are here to stay. What I have here is a graph illustrating the number of policies relating to diversity around the world. And you see that there's an increasing frequency in the implementation of gender diversity policies. We have quotas. We have quotas for state-owned companies. We have governance codes that particularly say that boards should think about the appointment of women when they're thinking about nominating new directors. And we also have disclosure rules that emphasize the disclosure of diversity policies. So many, many policies relating to boardroom diversity, all of these at the company level, again, right, they all target companies. So these policies are here to stay. But I think what we need to do really is take a harder look at the data and the assumptions in this debate in order to design policies that can really be effective. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions or if anyone has any questions.
Well, I'm going to assume that there aren't any questions, but if there are questions, do stick your hand up and I'll hand the microphone over to you. But I suspect there aren't any questions because René's presentation was so full and informative. So I want to say, on behalf of Sibos, thank you so much. And also just to let people know that this spotlight, as all the other Sibos spotlights, they're part of Sibos University Stream, which is brought here by the Swift Institution. So many thanks to Swift. We've had a really interesting session today. And also there is a diversity session on Thursday morning, so if you're interested in that, and I think Thomas and René will both be part of that. But let's give René another big Sibos thank you. René Adams, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.